and welcome back to the Ship of Thesis and Air Crusader Kings 3 tutorial series. Today we are going to be following on from our previous video, which was an in-depth look at the eugenics and traits system inside of Crusader Kings 3, and we're going to specifically talk around strategies around how you deal with incest. So I'm going to actually flick from being in the game now back to the slides as I did in the previous video. So I guess I should just quickly apply the caveat that I applied on the previous video, which is if you are not into heavy stats, then maybe this isn't the video for you. Although I would say I'd expect this video to be a bit less stat heavy than last time. This is more focused around the strategies of managing your dynasty and how you can kind of mitigate inbreeding, although it's gonna kind of need to be done if you're trying to create some kind of master race inside of the game. But caveats aside, let's just jump straight into the content, shall we? Okay, so this is where we left things off in our previous video, or at least this is where we'd last discussed how traits are passed on. So for a very, very quick refresher on that, when we are looking to have multiple traits and we want to, you know, kind of pass those multiple traits on, then we are going to at some point consider inbreeding. So in this scenario, we wanted to pass on fecund and strong. And I said that the ovals represent marrying people outside of your dynasty, so mixing with new blood and avoiding inbreeding, and that's definitely the safest way. So by doing that here and marrying off, or having a child with at least somebody with the fecund trait, we were able to produce another double character, and then maybe we divorced this person, or maybe we had a lover with this other one, and we bred with the strong person, and then we ended up with another double trait. And then at that point we could decide to breed these two together, and at this point the inbreeding would be happening, right? And in terms of what inbreeding this would look like, this would be two half brothers / sisters that we'd be breeding together at this point, which is a reasonably but not too bad of a risk. And that's specifically why I wanted to start on this slide here, because I wanted to discuss the level of risk that you take when you do inbreeding. So in terms of risk, before we go on and talk specifically about that example that we just talked about, these are a list of things that you can get just by inbreeding, right? So these are a list of negative traits that you can gain just because you have inbred. They're not gained necessarily because you have the inbred trait. They happen because you are doing inbreeding. And as you can see, there's a natural prevalence here. So just because you've started doing some inbreeding means that these negative traits can just enter your bloodline. So you need to be aware that once you start playing the inbreeding game, there's an actual risk that you could end up with these traits occurring. They're not super likely, but you know, the risk is definitely there for all of them. Giant technically as well is the only one on this list that you could maybe consider a positive. I mean, it has a negative impact, but it also has a positive impact, whereas I think pretty much all of the others are just plain bad. So moving on, the real risk when you are inbreeding anyway, aside from those other traits that we've been discussing, are that, oops, you might go a little bit Habsburg. You might gain the trait inbred. And if you're not familiar with the Habsburg royal family, that's where their lovely chin comes from. Habsburg chin is a statement that's used to basically discuss inbreeding in general. In the game, gaining the inbred trait is bad, very bad in fact. You get -5 to all of your stats, as you can see here. You get -2 on your prowess. You get -50% to your attraction because you look kind of, well, like this. And your opinion is also affected negatively with other characters because you're inbred, and inbreeding is generally considered bad. And then lastly, you suffer a pretty whopping health modifier. That's 75% debuff to your health. So be aware that when you start to play the inbreeding game, you may pick up this trait, and it's a really bad trait. Firstly, because it has all of these horrible stat debuffs that get applied here. Secondly, because it makes you less fertile. In fact, I said attraction opinion. In fact, this is fertility, I think. Rather than attraction opinion. The attraction opinion is here. So yeah, it makes you less fertile, it makes you less liked, it makes your stats bad, but it's also a congenital trait. So when we were discussing before about things that you can pass on, the inbred trait, once it's in your bloodline, is something that you then need to try and breed out of your bloodline, because it's congenital. It will pass on to the, you know, the next child and the next and the next, theoretically, using the same examples that we did in the previous video. I'm not going to rehash the previous video. If you haven't watched it, I'll make a little thing appear, pachow, in the corner. So yeah, go and watch that if you've not yet done so. But yes, just be aware that once you start inbreeding, you know, it's a slippery slope. You can end up with a bit of a Habsburg. Or perhaps, as I've put at the bottom here, you can get a bit lucky. You can end up with the pure-blooded trait. That is really, really lucky, and I'll show you the numbers on that later. But the reason this is such a sought-after trait, particularly if you were to go and browse through Reddit, people are very proud when they manage to get this trait. You get plus 10% fertility, which is just nice. You get a little bit of health boost, which is nice. But the real kicker, the real good thing, is that you get a negative 50% inbreeding chance. Now, if you can combine someone to have the pure-blooded trait from both their parents, i.e. if two people who have pure-blooded breed with one another, then not only are they extremely likely to pass on the pure-blooded trait to their children, but they also have a 100% chance of not passing on the inbred trait. So it's huge. It's really, really good. However, like I said, damn, you got lucky if you got this. It's not statistically super likely to happen, but we'll discuss that a little bit more as the video winds on. So I thought I'd also include this chart. So I think I mentioned in the previous video, all of my information that I've gathered for this video has come either from the Crusader Kings 3 wiki page, or it's come from the actual game files themselves, or it's just come from my empirical knowledge from playing the game and testing things out. In this case, this chart here is from the Wikipedia page, and this just gives you an example of how inbred quickly escalates, and the table below is basically the same information that you can see in the chart. I included it in case you prefer tables to charts, basically. But what you can really see here is the number of common ancestors, and we're going to go into detail with that because people don't always necessarily digest their information from charts. So I'm going to show you with a diagram as well, so we can really, you know, drill down into this and hopefully make sure that it makes sense. But in terms of strategies, which is what this video is about, you want to try and avoid this chart getting too high, basically. You want to keep the number of common ancestors low, which means you are going to need to do inbreeding if you want to get those multiple stats, or those multiple traits, rather, bred into the next, you know, set of characters. But you kind of want to do it mitigating the chance of getting inbred and getting those nasty traits as, you know, as much as possible. So really keeping it around here in the middle of the chart is reasonable. Like, obviously, if you can keep it further to the left, fantastic. But keeping it sort of in the middle isn't too bad. You're talking, you know, a kind of 10% chance, 12% chance of something bad happening at that point, which is, you know, still high if you're having a lot of children, but you can kind of work around that. The moment that you jump up over those numbers, though, I mean, if you just look at these numbers here, if you're not looking at the chart, I mean, wow, like 40%, 60%, 90%, like, it's pretty big. You are likely to end up with that trait being passed on. So just be mindful that the more common ancestors that you have, the more chance that your children are going to end up being inbred. So, pure-blooded. I did mention earlier that pure-blooded is a trait that people chase. And what I've done here is I've also included the chance to inherit it. So if you get the pure-blooded trait, you can pass that trait on to your children. If you're a single parent, it's 15% chance. If both parents have it, it's 75%. So once you get it, continuing to breed it is definitely, you know, on the top of the agenda. And if you get it on one parent, it doesn't mean that you need to keep it in the dynasty at that point. You could go and have a look in the character finder to see if you could find somebody else who has pure-blooded. They probably won't, but, you know, maybe you'll get lucky. Again, here, in order to gain the pure-blooded trait where you're not inheriting it, so to gain it in the first instance, which means to naturally obtain it, you need to be breeding with common ancestors. So if you're between 0 and 19, then you have a 0% chance of naturally occurring pure-blooded. You need to basically be breeding 20 to 21 for it to even give you a chance. And if you look at this, 3% to 3.15%, it's just so low, guys. It's gonna happen eventually, but it's gonna be really rare. And you're going to get more inbred children than you are if you're playing around with these big numbers here. If you remember that previous chart, in fact, if we go back to it, look, if you're looking at 20 to 21, you've got a 40 to 42% chance. And above that, you're going into crazy numbers. So you want to be super, super careful, in my opinion. But, you know, if you're just chasing the trait, then chase the trait. You know, I can't make you play the game the way that I would suggest. But I'd recommend don't get too hung up on pure-blooded. Anyway, like I've said at the bottom here, this is how you gain it naturally. Similar to the chance of inbreeding, the chance of gaining the pure-blooded trait naturally is based on the number of common ancestors, multiplied by the corresponding level factor for the amount of common ancestors. As a result, parents must have 20 common ancestors for a child to gain the pure-blooded trait naturally. This does not apply to inheriting it from parents, and that just means this section up here, where if you've already got the pure-blooded trait, then you get a 15% chance or a 75% chance if both parents have it. So, hopefully that makes sense. Next, I have included the chart from the Wikipedia page that explains what relations create common amounts of ancestors. Again, this is in table format, so if you don't learn well from this, that's fine. Maybe pause the video and read it. I'm not going to read it at you. It basically gives you a description of, you know, how many common ancestors occur based on particular types of breeding, from 4 siblings down to third cousins. I'm going to do that exact explanation myself now, but I'm going to use diagrams instead, because I think it translates a lot easier than reading a table, so it'll also be better for a video, I think. So without further ado, let's do that right now. So what I've done here is I have created that exact table that you've just been looking at, but I've done it in terms of the actual formula that it uses. So max ancestors equals 2n plus 1 minus 2. So don't worry about that. It basically just means this, right? If you look at your family tree and you and your sibling do the wrong thing and you inbreed, then this is how many people, like at that point, you are at 30 points. You are at the maximum number of common ancestors. Why? Well, because your parents form the first generation. So like I said in maybe the previous video or the one before that, you have to consider 4 generations deep when it comes to inbreeding. So in terms of inbreeding here, the first generation is your parents, the third generation would be grandparents, second generation would be great grandparents, and the first generation would be your great great grandparents. And as you can see, just because the nature of the family tree, it balloons dramatically. So your objective, we were talking about strategies, right? That's the point of this video. Your objective is to make sure that you limit the amount that you kind of go up this. So by breeding with someone directly, next to you in the family tree, you're going to end up with all these as common ancestors. So you don't want to do that. You want to try and mitigate this. Now, I'm going to admit something here. I'm going to load the next slide. I sometimes personally forget how the whole cousins thing works in real life. So I'm not trying to teach anyone to suck eggs by showing you this table. If you already, understand how family trees work, then, all power to you. But if you maybe, like me, sometimes go, oh, how do first cousins and third cousins work again? This hopefully explains it. Now, bear in mind, with this table here, it's only one side of the family. So I've put you over here in the left, and then there's a singular parent. Obviously, there's always going to be 2 parents, and each parent has, their own parents, i.e. you have 2 grandparents on that side, which means a total of 4. So like if we look at the previous slide, you can see it goes up and balloons, right? So, 4 grandparents becomes 8 great grandparents, and so on and so forth. So just be mindful of that. But hopefully this table, or this diagram rather, gives you an idea of how the family tree stuff works. And you can use this to kind of count back to work out whether or not you've got a lot of common ancestors, right? So if you are breeding with your brother or sister, remember, then the first connecting point is a parent, and therefore there's going to be 2 parents. So then you know, oh, okay, it's going to balloon up from there. If, however, you wanted to breed, let's say, with your 3rd cousin, then you go 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, because remember, you go 4 generations back, and then the 4th generation would be your great-great-grandparent. So at that point, you know that there's actually not that many points that you're kind of connecting. So a great-great-grandparent is really, really high up the tree. You're not going to share that many people in common. So, in fact, it's going to leave you with 2 people here at this section. So you're only actually going to have 2 common ancestors, if that makes sense. So that's enough on this. Like I said, I'm not trying to teach anybody to suck eggs. It just helped me get it straight in my head, and hopefully it will help you guys as well. Before we move on, actually, in terms of cousins removed, I don't believe the game counts cousins removed. So I think first cousins are always just counted as first cousin. Second cousins are always just counted as second, and third are always just counted as third. As far as I'm aware, I think that's the case. So I put this section in here, but I don't want a Habsburg chin. And neither should you. So in terms of strategies, what can you do? Well, first you can limit your inbreeding. If you can obtain a trait from outside of your bloodline, then that is safest. Press C to use the character finder to see who is out there. So I'm just going to very quickly switch over back to the game just so that we can look exactly at that. So I think I've possibly shown this before, but just, you know, for the sake of argument, if you press C, you will get the character finder. And this is a very cool tool, very useful, in fact, especially if you're looking for people to breed with. Now, bear in mind, we're normally looking for traits. So let's say we want to look for fecund. You can just type the name of the trait in here and then select it. So you can see there's nobody in my top realm. Generally, you'll want to look across all, and you'll want to set diplomatic range to inside. If you don't set it to inside, then the people that you're going to see, you're going to have no likelihood of getting them into your court, basically. We're going to talk a little bit more about how you get people into your court in just a moment, but this is just a way for you to, you know, go and find people. You can, you know, style it by gender. You only want to see females if you're a male, and vice versa. You probably want to see people who are breedable, but, you know, you might be happy to take children and betroth them. And you can just play around with all of these different settings to go and find the characters that you need. So just to be aware that that is there, and that's your first option, really. Next up. Create your own breeding stock. People in your court cannot refuse arranged marriages. So we're going to go straight back to the game and discuss what that means. So what is your court? Your court is basically the list of people who are where you reside, basically inside of your capital, pretty much. So if you look over in the left-hand side in our character tab, you can click on relationships, and then courts is right next to it. So people who are in your court are basically a list of people. They can be guests, they can be family members who live inside of your court, and they can be also, they can be courtiers, which are basically, I think I mentioned in one of the first videos in this series, they're basically people who are kind of nobility, and they're the well-to-do of society, that, you know, they kind of hang around you. And then there are your knights. So they're the people who do your fighting during wars and are very, very useful. And then lastly, you can have in your court, though not necessarily in your court, you may have council members as well. But given that council members can also be rulers, they're not necessarily in your court. Basically, people in your court are always beneath you. That's the key thing, really. Our son should be in our court. I don't know if we can find him in the list. What's his name? Brian. So is Brian in our list? So basically, people who are in your court. There you go. There's Prince Brian. They are people you can tell what to do. They cannot refuse you. They are underneath you. The reason why Brian is in our court, even though he is a member of our dynasty and therefore stands currently is the only living heir and stands to inherit all of this, is because we haven't landed him yet. He's not actually got a landed title, which means he just kind of kicks around in our castle, basically. And that's the best way of seeing people inside of your court. And the fact that you can tell them what to do is pretty awesome. We can right-click on people in our court, including our son here, and we can click Arrange Marriage. And if we pick a courtier to marry him, they cannot say no. Whereas if I try and go to the character screen, for example, and I try and arrange a marriage to Emma with my son, then in this scenario she would accept, but she might not, right? I could go find someone somewhere else who's going to say no, but because she's not in my court, then she could just straight up refuse, right? If I just pick somebody random over here, arrange marriage, and say, marry my courtier, please. She just about would accept. But yeah, you get the point, right? That at the minute this is happening because they are choosing to agree, but they might not agree. The reason why this is so powerful and why it's really, really relevant to this inbreeding video is because you can basically tell your courtiers what to do, and that means you can breed good traits into them, and you can then use them as breeding stock to breed into your dynasty. So that's just a straight up useful thing for you to consider. If you remember back from like the earlier chart that I showed you, I was using those ovals to always represent when we're bringing in people from outside the bloodline. If you breed one of these courtiers who's not in your dynasty right now, then, well, they aren't going to cause you any inbreeding. They will be fresh blood. So that's always a really good way for you to make sure that you are not polluting the bloodline too much by having loads and loads of inbreeding going on. If you keep on top of this over the course of your game, then you can do really well. It's also a really good way of buffing your actual knights, for example. So right here, our half-brother and marshal and knight, if we click on him, he is a knight with a prowess of 12. He actually doesn't have any congenital traits right now, but if we actually go to the find character screen and look for strong, for example, and we make it anywhere, I just literally want to find somebody with a strong trait. You can see that the prowess that they get from just being strong is +4. So a trait like that is fantastic to put on your knights, because it's going to make your knights that much better. They're people who are going to fight for you, and that will make them better at wars. But equally then, they become available as a vector to keep strong inside of your dynasty, and to breed, you know, people with. One of the things that you're going to really want to do is try to mitigate too much close breeding. So you actually, it's worth me pointing this out, you actually can't breed your siblings together. So your children, you can't, I couldn't arrange a marriage, for example, if I had a daughter here, which I do, right? I can't arrange a marriage, you notice, with them. If I do arrange a marriage here and I try to find my son, he's not in the list. It won't allow me to do that. And that's because our religion currently is insular Christianity, and that has the consanguinity rule of avunculate marriage, which means marriages between cousins, aunts, nephews, uncles, and nieces is allowed, but you can't marry directly close to you. You just can't. Notice that there is also a mention of secrets in there, and we're going to discuss that in just a little moment. But hopefully that nails home the point that you can use this court as a nice breeding ground. Make sure they have jobs so that they don't wander off. Like, breeding with guests isn't ideal, just because if they swan off, they'll take everyone with them. So you need to make sure that they've got some form of investment to stick around. Once you've bred them and you've started to get some good traits into them, then maybe you just give them some kind of like petty title to keep them kicking around. But just, you know, be mindful that this is a really good pool for you to use. Not to mention that you can use these guys to secure decent alliances and things down the line, if you play your cards right. So that's enough on courts. What's next? So don't let the AI ruin your breeding, as it favors alliances and stats over traits. Be a pushy parent. Landing your children will give them some control over their own destiny. Control it for them. So I've kind of just mentioned that a little bit when we were talking about the court. If you land your son, then he then becomes his own boss. He becomes his own ruler. Even if he is a vassal of yours, he now has a say. He will now go off and try and get himself married. Now, you can still propose it, but he's now his own boss. He's now his kind of own man. If you do it before he gets married and then land him, well, then he's stuck with the choice that you gave him, unless, you know, something unfortunate befalls his spouse. But you want to make sure that you're the one calling the shots and arranging the marriages and doing all of that kind of thing as much as you can, because yeah, like it's a super important thing. So yeah, do that. Be a pushy parent. I should point out, I did say that because of the Christianity rule, the avunculate marriage rule, that you can't have siblings have kids. That's not strictly true. I should mention that it can happen via events. If your brother falls in love with you, then he will end up having kids with you if you're a female, or can end up having kids with you if you are a female. So it's not that it can't happen, it's just that you can't actually engineer it yourself unless you change the rules. So you can get a religion that allows you to do unrestricted marriage, but they're pretty rare. I think there's only like 1 or 2 locations in the world that start with it, so you'd actually have to reform that religion, and that's not what this video is about, but I just thought I'd let you know that that's a thing. So next on the list is don't forget to reinforce those traits. So we mentioned this stuff in the previous video. You want to make sure that you're reinforcing the traits by making sure that you're marrying someone with a dominant trait to someone with a dominant trait, and if somebody ends up with a recessive trait, make sure you marry them to a dominant trait to keep that trait alive. If you don't know what that means because you didn't watch the previous video, go back and watch it, and then it should hopefully all make sense. Although pretty much what I've just said is a pretty good summary. Likewise, if you have a tiered trait, go back and watch the previous video where I explain how tiered traits work. But if you have a tiered trait, then make sure that you're always using the highest level trait when you're doing the breeding, and then that way you'll reinforce getting the absolute best trait. Next up is disinherit and divorce. Once you have what you need, move on. So yeah, there's no reason why, if you are literally hunting for traits at this point and trying to build an amazing dynasty, you can disinherit people who get bad traits. If you end up doing inbreeding and you end up with inbred children, well, just disinherit those suckers. If they're no good and they've got terrible stats and they're club-footed and hunchbacked, and don't have the amazing fecund and strong trait that you're trying to breed in, then just get rid of them. If your spouse has given you a strong child and fecund children, and she's now no longer able to produce more heirs, then get rid of her, either legally or divorce her using an axe, and then you can go and marry other people and make more traits. So yeah, consider that. And next is get the first 3 blood legacy perks. So I'm going to skip back to the game just so I can show you where those are. So there are actually 2 ways to get to the legacy screen. You can either click on your house crest and then open legacies in the bottom left here, or alternatively, just from the main screen, if you go up to the top right where renown is and click on that, that takes you to the same screen as if you clicked on the crest rather, and then you can click on open legacies. Now the one that we're particularly interested in here is the blood. If you get nothing else, get the noble veins level 1 perk for blood. I would pretty much recommend this, even if you're interested in all of the other legacies. But if you get this, then the chance of inheriting good congenital traits goes up by 30%, which is huge. If you don't know why that's huge, then you didn't watch my previous video. Go back and watch the previous video where I showed you all the stats. Add that plus 30% to the tables that I showed you, and you'll see that it's pretty much going to guarantee that you get that trait that you are trying to breed. You basically get rid of the RNG, pretty much. So, you know, go get this perk. It's really, really good. The chance of getting good congenital traits is also plus 30%, and that's just kind of a random, like, you might get good things. But the inheritance thing is the real reason that you want it. The second level of this perk is convergent blood. That gives you the chance of reinforcing congenital traits. Again, this is just awesome. The fact that it's plus 30% means, again, I said one of the big points was to make sure that you reinforce those traits. Getting this just makes that easier. It removes the RNG. Get this, it makes your life easier. And then lastly, I would recommend that you get resilient bloodline. Chance of inheriting bad congenital traits goes down by negative 30. Again, if you go back and watch the previous video, if you haven't seen it, we discussed the percentage chance of passing things on, and you want to breed out those bad traits, and this just makes that much easier. Though I would say out of all of these, the noble veins one is the one to get. The other two are great. The last two in this are kind of meh. If you want them, go ahead and get them. Selecting a congenital trait to become more common is nice, but by the time you get here, you've probably already created something amazing. And the octogenarians means that you get an extra life expectancy of +5. That's really only useful for male characters, because women can't breed after the age of 45. So once they hit 46, that's it. There's no more kids for women. So living an additional 5 years is kind of pointless. But for men, I guess it means that you can keep doing the whoopee for a bit longer. So yeah, I mean, it's okay. There are better perks elsewhere in the tree, to be honest, but I shall leave that up to you. So next up we have make a decision, strengthen your bloodline. So again, we're going to flick back to the game just to discuss where this is. So we're back in a different save file, and we have the genius perk added to this character. And the reason I had to do that is so that I can actually show you this in the decisions. So if we hit F8 to load decisions, under major decisions, you can now see the strengthen bloodline option. So this might not appear in your major decision list until you actually have a trait that makes you at least partially eligible. The decisions that get displayed kind of rotate, I believe, based on whether or not you're kind of close to being able to do it. It's a little bit weird. Like I said, until you've actually got the trait to fulfill some of this, it might not show up, but it is normally available. So just to make that clear. So basically the strengthen bloodline decision allows you to, when you are the dynasty head and you have a trait in both the Bright Minds, Beautiful Characters and Physical Specimens group, and basically you need to have at least Genius, Beautiful and Herculean and have no bad congenital traits, then you get the option to fire the Strengthened Bloodline group. So basically you need to fill all of these things. If you do this and you fire off the Strengthened Bloodline group, it actually doesn't tell you in the tooltip, which is slightly irritating. Basically, I believe you get a plus 40% modifier towards passing on traits, which is really, really good. If you actually went about and combined this with the legacy perk that we've already mentioned of passing on good traits, you'd be getting a whopping 70% modifier for good traits, which is just insane. That's basically you are guaranteed to pass this on now. There is no way you could possibly fail. So this is a good thing to get, but because you need to have all of these traits already on your character and no congenital defects basically, and be the dynasty head, then this is more of a after you've already done a bit of the breeding game that this can happen, but it's definitely a good thing to do. It's a nice option to take, so don't ignore it basically. And then lastly we've got don't worry about pure blood. If it happens, then it happens. 1.5 to 3% is tiny, but if you get it, then definitely reinforce it. We discussed this earlier, so I'm not going to go over it anymore. That takes us to the end of this sort of strategy video, really. So hopefully you've seen where the danger of inbreeding lies. You've seen where you should and shouldn't do the breeding. So again, I guess that's probably the most important part to discuss. So you want to make sure that you're breeding your people to cousins, really, rather than closer than that. As far away as you can get away with, basically, to reinforce those traits. And you've also seen like how you can pick up legacy perks, how you can make various decisions to reinforce good traits, and how you can make sure that you have a good collection of people in your court as good breeding stock that you can definitely bully around and make them marry and produce those traits for you. So I would recommend that you do that. Like I said, if you manage your court well, that's probably the easiest way for you to gradually introduce traits kind of on the sidelines while you're refining your actual characters, and then kind of gradually marry them into different branches of your tree. If you consider that there's branches to your massive tree, if you have lots and lots of kids, you probably want to start out with the fecund trait and maybe even the beautiful trait, because again, that's just going to massively impact your fertility. And at the end of the day, this is a lot of RNG, so the more dice you roll, the more successful you will be in the long run. So have lots of kids, disinherit the ones that you don't need, chop off the heads of the spouses that you don't need anymore, or maybe just divorce them, and yeah, like you'll eventually get the kind of dynasty that you're looking for. The last page that I've included here says that traits aren't everything, and I guess that's a really important thing for us to end on. I've done all of these videos on how you pass traits on, how you make sure you get the best traits, basically how you kind of min-max this, but it's kind of within a bubble, right? This isn't, you know, you don't live in a vacuum when you're playing Crusader Kings 3, so the amazing set of traits that you have doesn't mean much if all of your neighbors married for alliances and just fabricated claims on all of your titles. So yeah, I mean, that is definitely true, right? If all of your neighbors are united against you because they've been marrying for alliances, which the AI tends to do, then you're going to need some alliances yourself unless you've got an amazingly good set of levy. And congratulations on your perfect heir. It would be a shame if something happened to it. You know, that's another thing that you need to consider in this game. If you create an amazing heir, then the chances are that the game is then going to RNG that child into getting some kind of horrible sickness that's going to kill them, or someone's going to assassinate them, or they're going to fall down the stairs in a random event and become incapable, or something like that. So just be aware that just because you've gone to the effort of creating a superhuman doesn't mean that they will be super forever, and they can ruin your plans. You can make the most perfect child, and then they go, oh, by the way, I'm a homosexual, and I'm not going to be having children now. You know, all of those things can definitely happen. So keep those in mind as you play. And then lastly, I've put that incest is frowned upon and will hurt the opinion with almost everyone. Plus, it can be used to blackmail you. So if you remember earlier, I said you get secrets applied for incest. That's definitely true, and those secrets can be used to gain hooks on you that can be used to by your vassals to make you give them more favourable contracts, or give them positions on the council, or make you vote with them some way, depending on where you sit in the hierarchy. So just be mindful that there's also, you know, these are all the negatives to playing the incest game and to chasing nothing but traits. You know, the game's much wider than just creating some kind of master race, basically. But that was the topic for these sets of videos, and this does round the topic out nicely. So I think that's everything you really need to learn on this now. I do thank you all very much for watching. I'd love some feedback of whether or not these are helpful, whether or not you like these more in-depth style videos. If you could like and comment and subscribe and do all of those lovely YouTube things, that would definitely help me out. I'm only a small channel after all. But, you know, that's your choice. I still thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.